And you're in the way of the
this weird
DNC.
uniformity.
But its effect is to ignore stories that are objectively the most important stories. I mean, wherever you fall on those questions, there's no denying that the war in Ukraine is changing the world. It will change history. Most of the stuff is a footnote. That's a book, and yet the coverage of it is not even.
Yeah.
So, for example, the president.
That's much more consequential.
Well, it's the most consequential, but it's
and the coverage of me, which is there's no questioning of these orthodoxies. And when it comes to the Ukraine war, I mean, we're being lied to about it.
In what way?
Well, I mean, we were lied to from the beginning. You know, we had this comic book depiction that, which we see on every war. There's a bad guy who's unspeakably evil.
Yes.
Who's planning world conquest or a terrorist attack on on America, and we have to be the good guys and go in and stop it. And the background of the Ukraine war is much more complex than that. The U.S. has been involved, and particularly the neocons in the White House. I wouldn't say particularly. I'd say a group of people that are known as neocons since 2001 have been talking about putting NATO in Ukraine. Now, and I'll give you the background. In 1992, the walls came down and the Soviet Union collapsed. Gorbachev went to Tony Blair and to President Bush, who were the British, the UK and US presidents at that time, and said, I'm going to do something extraordinary that basically is going to have the rest of Russian history branding me as a traitor to my country. I'm going to withdraw 400,000 Soviet troops from East Germany, and I'm going to allow you to reunify Germany under NATO troops. So you're going to move NATO troops, a hostile force, into our barracks and our bases. I'm going to do that, and the only commitment I want from you is that once I allow Germany to reunify, to become part of NATO, that you will never move NATO further to the east, because we're going to now release all of these Soviet states that were part of the Soviet Union. They're going to become independent states, and we don't want NATO moving into those. And James Baker, who was the Secretary of State at that time, famously said, we promise that we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. So Gorbachev now did that, and he's now, despised in Russia. And then in 1996 and 1997, so 5 years later, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the first kind of the father of the neocon movement, what the neocons represent in a sentence is that they were a group of people who believed, and Donald Rumsfeld and Jonathan Yu and Paul Wolfowitz, Robert Kagan, Victoria Nuland, who's now at the top State Department official, their belief was that the U.S. had won the Cold War, and that victory gave us the privilege of dominating the world using our superior military unipower status and our superior military status for the next century. So their principal blueprint document is called Project for a New American Century. In other words, America would own the 21st century. So Brzezinski says, okay, we should start this process by moving NATO into all the former satellite states. Well, and this was 1997. At that time, George Kennan was still around. Now, George Kennan, as you know, was the principal architect of the Cold War containment policy. He's arguably the most important, most respected diplomat and statesman in American history. Oh, he said, if you do that, you are going to provoke a violent response from Russia. They cannot live with NATO on their borders. They cannot, any more than we would live with a Soviet alliance in Mexico and Canada. At that time, Bill Perry was Clinton's Secretary of State, and Bill Perry said, if you do this, if you go forward with this plan, I'm going to resign, because it's so foolhardy. You are forcing Russia into a violent military response. And the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union at that time, who is now the head of the CIA, said the same thing. It's the worst mistake America can make to move NATO to the east. So we went ahead and did it. We moved it not 1 inch, but 1,000 miles, 14 countries, and then we put nuclear-ready missile launchers, Aegis missile systems, which are made by Lockheed and can take Tomahawk missiles 12 minutes from Moscow. We could, in 12 minutes, decapitate the entire leadership of Russia. And we put those in Poland and Romania. And we then tried to move it into NATO into Ukraine. So you remember when my uncle, when Russia put missile systems, nuclear missile systems in Cuba, and my uncle would have had to invade, he was able. The reason Russia put them there then is because we had put nukes, Jupiter missiles, in Turkey and Italy. My uncle and father made a secret deal with Ambassador Dobrynin, where they said to him, look, we understand you're angry. You cannot live with Jupiter missiles in Turkey. That's why you put your missiles in Cuba. If you remove your missiles from Cuba within 6 months, we will remove ours from Turkey. But nobody says what the deal was. And that's what happened. So now we're back, and we've again put nuclear-ready missile systems along right next to Russia. And now we want to go do the one thing that Russia has said, and Putin said again and again and again, this is a red line. Before Putin, the Russian leadership was saying it is a red line. You cannot go into Ukraine. The Russians have been invaded 3 times from you. Our country's never been invaded. The Russians were invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time they were invaded, Hitler killed between 20 and 40 million Russians. Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. In my uncle's speech to his most famous speech in American University in 1963, in July of 1963, he said to the American people, he said, we are all taught we won World War II, but we didn't win World War II. The Russians won it. And the sacrifice they made to destroy Hitler was beyond anything Americans can imagine. He was trying to tell the American people, you have to put ourselves in their position and understand what they're doing. And he said, a third of the country was leveled. Every city, the forests burned, the cities were leveled, the forests and fields burned. Imagine if that happened from the coast, the east coast of the United States, to every city, forest and field from here to Chicago. That's what the Russians put up with. So we have to understand this, that Ukraine is a red line. The invasion came through Ukraine, and they can't live with it. It's a security issue for them that is almost beyond our comprehension. And so, we've had...
But so that suggests the point is war with Russia.
The point was war with Russia. And in fact, the neocons said that again and again, and Biden, when he was and let me get back to that, okay, because that is absolutely true. The Biden, was first of all, in 2014, to go through the modern history, 2014, there are riots it's called the Maidan Rebellion in Ukraine, which we're not told that we are financing those riots. The newspapers never told us, our government never told us. USAID, which is a CIA front, put $5 billion into funding those riots. Those riots lead to a coup d'etat against the first democratically elected government of the Ukraine. It was a government that refused to choose sides and to say we're going to be on the side of the West. So we wanted them out. A month before that government is overthrown, Victoria Nuland, who's the part of the centerpiece of the neocon ideology and who is now a high-level official in the State Department, has a secret call with the U.S. ambassador, which is tape recorded and is now public, which anybody can go and look up, where she is picking the new cabinet for Ukraine, which is which is a U.S. Western cabinet. So they're picking the new government a month before the old government is overthrown.
Is that how democracy when Victoria Nuland picks her government?
Well, that's the point, is USAID doesn't really do, and the CIA don't do democracy. The CIA has overthrown, I think, 83 governments between 1947 and 1997. That's a third of the governments on Earth, and most of them were democracies. Oh, it doesn't do democracy. It does coup d'etats. So then, to put the rest of this history, and we put in a Western government. Everybody says, well, the Russians started this by invading Crimea. But put yourself in Putin's position. And I'm not an apologist for Putin, by the way. He went into Ukraine. It was illegal. My son went over there and fought against it, and risked his life in the Kharkiv rebellion. I'm not making excuses for him. What he did was brutal. It was illegal and it was unnecessary. But we have to understand our role in the provocations. And so if you're in Putin's position, now you're looking at Ukraine, and Ukraine is being run by a pro-U.S. government. What's the first thing he thinks? They're going to take Vladivostok, which is the port in the Crimea on the Black Sea, which has been a Russian port, their only warm water port for 347 years. It's where the Russian Navy is, their sub base, it's everything else. And he says, now this new government is going to invite the U.S. Navy in to take over our facilities. We got to go in there and take it back. So he goes into Crimea. He goes in and takes Crimea without firing a shot or killing a single person. The Crimean population is largely Russian, and they welcome the invasion. So, again, I'm not making excuses for him, but I'm saying we have to understand. My uncle always said we have to understand the position of our adversaries, and what forces are they dealing with. So then then the Russians now there's as soon as we put in that new government, the first rule they pass is to make the Russian language essentially illegal in Donbass and Lugansk, where 90% of the population are Russian. And there's then peaceful uprising, which people begin dying. They turn violent. Now, which side made them violent is a dispute. But it's not a dispute that the Russians were now being treated. The ethnic Russian population in Ukraine is now being treated like redheaded stepchildren. They're not, they're being slapped around and they're being abused and they're not being allowed to practice their culture or their language. And so there's a vote then in Donbass and Lugansk where they vote 90-10 to join Russia. Russia says no. Putin says no, I don't want you, but let's sign an agreement that protects you. So they put together an agreement with France, Germany, and Russia called the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords say leave Donbass and Lugansk as part of Ukraine, but make them semi-autonomous so they can speak their own language, and so the Russians who live there are going to be protected from violence by the government. And the Russian parliament or the Ukrainian parliament won't ratify the Minsk Accords, but France agreed to it, Germany agreed to it, and Putin agreed to it. So then Zelensky runs in 2019. Zelensky is a comedian and he's an actor. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory way because my wife is a comedian and actor, but I'm saying it because here's a guy with no political background who wins the election with 90% of the vote. Why did he win the election? He won the election because he ran on a peace platform. He ran promising that he would sign the Minsk Accords. He gets into office. The minute he gets there and he's told everybody, I'm going to sign the Minsk Accords and settle the peace with Russia, he suddenly pivots. And we don't know what happened, but the rational assumption is that the U.S. government told him he could not do that. So the Victoria Nuland and Anthony Blinken and Avril Haines, who's the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, told him you cannot have a peace with Russia. Plus, people within, ultranationalists within Ukraine told him, if you sign that, we're going to kill you. And a lot of people say, anyway, they threatened him with death, and that is pretty well documented. Then Russia invades. But Russia only invades, and so we say, oh, look, Putin is trying to take over Europe. But they only send in 40,000 troops. I think there's 3.5 million people in Kiev, so they clearly did not want to take the country. He clearly wanted to bring people to the negotiating table. He did not send in enough troops to take all of Ukraine. So then Zelensky comes to the negotiating tables, and we now know this, and this is recent information. In March of 2022, Zelensky and Putin agree on a peace agreement that's based upon the Minsk Accords. It's like Minsk Accords 2.0. And Zelensky initials it, the Russians initial it, and Russia begins withdrawing its troops from Ukraine. And what happens? President Biden sends Boris Johnson over there to torpedo the agreement and make Zelensky tear it up. And then we go to war, 350,000 Ukrainian kids are now dead. And 40 or 50,000 Russians. So, and that month, April is when they signed it in March. April, Boris Johnson was sent over there to torpedo it. And that month, Lloyd Austin, who is the Secretary of Defense under Biden, is asked, why are we at war in Ukraine? And he said, our purpose in this war is to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. But that is not what they're telling us.
But do they?
And Biden that month says, when he's asked about the war in Ukraine, he says, our purpose is regime change in Russia. So again, that has nothing to do with Ukraine. What that means is that Ukraine is a proxy in essentially a struggle between two superpowers, between Russia and the United States. And, we've now committed $113 billion over there. And just to put that in perspective, the total budget of EPA is $12 billion. The total budget of the CDC is $12 billion. We're sending $113 billion over. When Mitch McConnell was asked, how can we do this? When you're cutting food stamps and cutting Medicare, cutting food stamps to 30 million Americans, cutting Medicare to 15 million Americans, they're not going to have any health insurance. How can we send 113 billion over there? If we had that 113 billion here, we wouldn't have had to cut one food stamp payment. And he said, well, don't worry, the money's not staying in Ukraine. It's all coming back to military contractors in the United States. Well, so that's interesting, because then you look at, who owns those military contractors, and you see who gets on CNN to pump up the Ukraine war. It's a bunch of former generals and colonels and Pentagon people, but if you go in, and CNN never, and MSNBC never do this, but if you go look at those guys, they're all people who are working for Raytheon and General Dynamics and Boeing and Lockheed. So they're generals, but they're not identified that, they're actually working for the military contractors who are cashing in on the war. And then, those military contractors in turn are owned by three companies. All of them are owned by three companies, by BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And the inflation that from printing the money to fund the war, to fund the 16 trillion we spent to fund the lockdowns, the COVID lockdowns, 8 trillion we've spent on these wars since 2020, all of them losing wars, all of them that made our country less safe. Look at what this war is doing. We have pushed Russia into the embrace of China, which is the worst foreign policy outcome imaginable. It is not good for the national security of our country, and we're now have Putin's back to the wall. Well, Putin is the world's leading nuclear superpower. We aren't. He's got 1,000 more nukes than we do, and their nukes are much better than ours. They can shoot down our nukes. We can't shoot down theirs. oh, we are going up against, we are provoking a confrontation that could very easily lead to nuclear war. And I've talked to.
Wait, can I ask you to pause there for a second? Yeah. Everything you've said is checkable and rational, and you're extrapolating out toward the future, which is easy to envision. Like, I don't understand how our policymakers aren't reaching the same conclusions you just reached. Like, they think that war with Russia is a war we're going to win?
We cannot win this war.
Well, of course, so what are they doing? I don't understand. It would be
like Mexico beating us in a war. They're not going to let the Ukraine, they cannot lose this war. And, anybody who thinks Russia is not up to the war, go look at the Netflix documentary on Stalingrad and look at the sacrifice the Russians are willing to make. Putin today, we thought this was going to hurt him. He's more popular than he's ever been. All the U.S. polling firms show him polling at 90% popularity. And
in Russia.
In Russia, the Russians are supporting him. And he also, we were going to break him with the sanctions. We did the opposite. We made him more powerful. He's now insulated from the trade and the international banking system. He's now got this great trade agreement with China. He's now, engineering the creation of BRICS, which has 40 leading nations around the world turning against the U.S. currency as a reserve currency and adopting his petrocurrency or the Chinese currency. That is the worst threat to the United States. That will if we lose that status as the world's reserve currency, the Great Depression will look like a cake.